Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Music and Mythocracy of Colonel Bruce Hampton, a basically true biography, by Jerry Grillo, foreword by Chuck Lavelle, narrated by Chris Abernathy. Foreword. The first time I met Bruce Hampton, late 1970 or early 1971, we were in the offices of Capricorn Records in Macon, Georgia, and he did what he's done to countless people over the course of his lifetime. He kind of blew my mind. I'd been touring with Alex Taylor, James Taylor's older brother, and recorded the album Dinner Time with him on Capricorn. I'd heard about Bruce. This is before he was known as Colonel Bruce Hampton, retired or otherwise, as he already had quite the reputation as a unique, if somewhat bizarre and strange performer around the Atlanta area. When we met, he looked right at my face and said, "April 28th. That, of course, is my birthday. I thought it was some kind of trick. This was long before you could find out anything about anyone on the internet, and that's when I found out about his uncanny ability to look at people and guess their birthdays. If he didn't guess it exactly, he was always very close, usually within a day or two. Another amazing thing he could do, it was amazing to me anyway, was tell you the batting averages of so many baseball players, and throughout their careers, and their runs batted in, and just about any pitcher's earned run average. I mean, how weird is that? Eventually, I heard his band, the Hampton Grease Band, which indeed confirmed the stories and rumors I'd heard about their performances. Bruce was sometimes known as the Frank Zappa of the South. I felt like that was a somewhat accurate description. But Bruce was even more eccentric in his way than Zappa was. I thought he was hypnotizing, intriguing, inventive, brave, bold, and fun. His performances mixed music, theater, craziness, and confusion in a most entertaining way. As time went on and I landed the gig with the Allman Brothers Band, I slowly got to know Bruce better. The Hampton Grease Band broke up, but Bruce kept putting together these other incredible bands that were always interesting. Eventually, I was asked by Bruce and our mutual friend and producer, Johnny Sandlin, to play on a live album with the Aquarium Rescue Unit. Bruce was the leader, and he had these top-notch musicians, Jimmy Herring on guitar, Oteil Burbridge on bass, Jeff Sipe on drums, Count Mbutu on percussion, and this amazing mandolin player named Matt Mundy. I accepted, and it was one of the strangest and most rewarding things I've ever done musically. I was given very little information about the songs before the show took place, and was more or less told, "Well, we're not sure what he's going to do, so just try to follow along. How's that for a rehearsal?" It put me on my toes like I'd never been before, and it remains one of the recordings I am proudest to be on. Many of us that played with, worked with, or were just friends with Bruce gathered at the Fox Theater to celebrate his 70th birthday on May 1st, 2017. This huge mix of musicians gladly and gratefully joined in for the show. Of course, as you know now, during the encore, Bruce had a massive heart attack and died. Many that knew him or had followed his career as fans said it was perhaps a fitting way for him to go. But I know Bruce didn't want to die. I believe he had much more that he wanted to accomplish, and he loved life. However, I will say that there was some degree of poetry in Bruce's exit, considering that he left this world on a stage, and a stage that he loved so much, the fabulous Fox. It's fitting that the profits from that show supported smaller theaters throughout Georgia, theaters that Bruce loved and admired, some of which he'd played during his more than 50 years of performing. My friend Jerry Grillo got to know Bruce well, and I'm so glad he wrote this book about our friend. Bruce's legacy is properly documented here in detail, and with respect, admiration, and love. I know you will enjoy this ride with one of the most interesting and influential talents ever to emerge from the South. Chuck Lavelle. Introduction. Bruce gets his backstage pass. At a lunch table in a diner that never closes, in some out-of-the-way dimension where up is down, in is out, and nowhere is now here, 3 spirits gather to shoot the shit and consume ethereal pancakes and crepes, a habit carried over from when they were alive. Enrico Scott, patting his heart. Bruce, man, I just want to thank you. Colonel Bruce Hampton, stealing a turkey sausage off Enrico's plate, dipping it in syrup. For what? Enrico, for getting me the gig with Derek. Bruce, chewing. Don't thank me, man. You got the gig. Johnny Knapp. Rico, don't waste your time. He's terrible with thank yous and compliments. Tell me what he did. Enrico. I was in jail for about 2 months, and the day I was being released, Bruce tells me, Derek Trucks needs a drummer in 12 hours. You're getting out in 8, so you have plenty of time to get your stuff and get to the gig. It changed my life. Johnny Knapp, who still has a high-pitched Brooklyn rasp in the afterlife. Wow, he changed your life too? Enrico, nodding to Johnny, then looking at Bruce. Yeah. But how did you know when I was getting out of jail, Bruce? I never told you that. Bruce, laughing maniacally, rolling his arms around each other, then raising spectral hands to the sky. Zambi! The art of fiction is dead. Reality has strangled invention. Those words, written by the late great Red Smith on a tight daily newspaper deadline, have haunted me since May 1st, 2017, when Colonel Bruce Hampton, musician and mythmaker, joker and bandleader, master of the absurd, collapsed in the last few moments of the last song during the encore of his 70th birthday celebration concert at the Fox Theater in Atlanta. Rushed to a nearby hospital, he died around 1 a.m. on May 2nd, making more headlines in death than he ever had during a rollicking, mind-bending, and widely influential 50-year career. That show, Hampton 70, ended with the most surreal moment of a surreal life, and the most dramatic rock and roll ending in a long history of rock and roll drama. It was poetic and horrifying, tragic and triumphant. Art, fiction, reality. Here was Colonel Bruce Hampton, elder statesman of the jam band scene, provocateur, and long-time unquestioned leader of great bands stocked with musicians, bringing 4,600 hearts to the apex of joy, then breaking them all to pieces in an instant. I'll probably die on stage, Bruce had said during an actual lunch among the living. Johnny Knapp was there, a few months before Hampton 70. One of several times I heard him say some version of this. I've got to die on stage, he said. I mean, it's inevitable. He used to talk a lot about intention, specifically regarding the playing or performing of music. He would say, What's your intention, boy? And, Get your butt out of your face. And, Why are you here? But I don't believe for a second that Bruce had any actual intention of dying that night, of making that kind of grim spectacle. That said, I don't think he argued very hard with whatever force takes us when the time comes. In the days following the concert, my thoughts kept going back to Red Smith. Smith's words here are borrowed from his lead for the column he wrote after witnessing Bobby Thompson's dramatic home run that lifted the New York Giants from the brink of death to beat the Brooklyn Dodgers in the last inning of a 3-game playoff series to win the National League pennant. Bruce, a baseball trivia nut, would have known all of that. And I imagine that he could be somewhere right now, maybe seated with kindred spirits in a transcendent diner, laughing hysterically at my dilemma. How to write his story when everybody knows the ending, which is more far-fetched than any of Bruce's tall tales. I was at Hampton 70 and saw what happened, and I still have a hard time believing it. Art, fiction, reality. But this was going to be a night to remember no matter how it ended. Ultimately, Bruce wanted to leave a lasting impression, elicit a reaction, put joy in the room. And everything was in place to accomplish that. Look at the show's lineup, for heaven's sake. Derek Trucks, Susan Tedeschi, Chuck Leavell, Warren Haynes, John Popper, Jimmy Herring, and Jeff Sipe. Musicians from Widespread Panic, Fish, and Leftover Salmon. Guitar prodigy Brandon Taz Niederauer and Jeff Mosier, Johnny Knapp, Carl Denson, Ike Stubblefield, and Denny Wally, among others. Bruce shared the stage with Grammy winners and a Cy Young Award winner, former big league pitcher Jake Peavy, now slinging a guitar instead of fastballs. In Denny Wally's long rock and roll career, he'd played with the two band leaders Bruce was most often compared to, Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart, Don Van Vliet. Of the two, Denny thought Bruce was more like Zappa. "It's the way Bruce and Frank put guys together," said Denny, who grew up in Frank's neighborhood and went to school with both Zappa and Beefheart. Like Frank, Bruce wanted musicians who knew how to express what he wanted to say musically. He had a real knack for finding exactly the right guys. Like Frank, Bruce wanted you to play like you. He didn't want to pigeonhole you. Denny, who at 74 was one of the older guys on stage, no one was older than Johnny Knapp, 88 at the time, was one of Bruce's newest collaborators, but they'd been in each other's orbits for decades. When Denny was living in New York in the 1970s, Bruce was hanging out there for extended periods, often staying with his friend Tom McNamee, who had co-produced the Hampton Grease Band's legendary only album for Columbia. "Bruce and I were hanging out in the Village at the same time," Denny said. "We saw the same shows, went to the same parties, probably stood 5 feet from each other, but didn't meet until many years later at Smith's old bar in Atlanta. We were talking several minutes when he blurts, 'Aquarius.' I said, 'Excuse me?' He said, 'You're easy. February 9th. No, wait. February 4th. I said, 'How'd you know my birthday?' I'd never met the guy, never talked to him in my life, so I'm checking my pockets to see if I dropped my wallet. After that, we became real close and discovered we'd walked a lot of the same ground." That was typical of Bruce. He walked the same ground with a lot of different people: musicians, artists, journalists, politicians, businessmen. Those connections weren't just something he collected. They weren't just names to drop. They were part of the Bruce Hampton galaxy, his orbit, his circle of friends, the colorful ingredients in the stew of his story. So, how to tell the story? Get other people to do it. That's been my modus operandi in my 35 years as an ink-stained wretch, talking with other people and getting them to share the stories that are uniquely theirs. Since Bruce was friendly with about 4% of the world's population, the challenge was knowing when to stop hunting and gathering. There's so much about Bruce that isn't in this book, stuff that I never learned, as well as stuff that I did learn but couldn't or didn't use, some stuff you may already know. Even so, I'm confident that you will learn something new about Colonel Bruce Hampton. Anecdotally speaking, most of the people that played in Bruce's bands considered themselves like a special unit of the music military and deemed their time with him a badge of honor. "You're nothing until you've been fired by Bruce Hampton," Enrico Scott said when he was alive. Enrico died as this manuscript was nearing completion, which is why he appears in the fact-based fantasy afterlife scene that opens this introduction. Musicians and other people who knew Bruce, including folks who weren't his friends or who'd fallen out with him, were my primary source material. They are the reason there is a book about Colonel Bruce Hampton. If I'd relied solely on what Bruce was willing to talk about, there would be nothing remotely linear about the story ahead. This work would still feature plenty of fabulous and creative tales, but they would not always be authentic or relatable. Besides, as I first began working on this book, Bruce kept insisting, "You've got to talk to this person," or "This guy has great stories, here's his number." Consequently, this book is as much oral history as it is anything else. When I first proposed the idea of a biography in 2011, Bruce was very receptive. He immediately started sharing contact information for old friends and bandmates, many of whom are quoted in this book. By that time, I'd known Bruce for several years. We met at the 2007 Sawtee Jamboree, a cool little 2-day music festival that once lived a few miles from my house in northeast Georgia. But I didn't start getting to know him until 2011, when he came to our corner of the universe to visit Widespread Panic lead singer John Bell, whose wife, Laura, runs a holistic wellness center in a nearby town. Bruce just materialized that day. We all went to lunch, and the more I got to know him, the truth and the mythocracy, the more I thought, I'd love to write about this guy. When I asked his permission to write the book, he acted as if he'd been expecting the question. "I was wondering when you were going to ask. Bruce said over the phone after I'd pitched the biography idea while walking compulsive Circle 8s in my driveway, where the cell service is better. "I know your work. You're a good cat," he continued. I liked that he called me a cat, and was flattered that he'd read the magazine stories I'd written, and that he remembered more about them than I did. And I was surprised that no one had written a book about Bruce already. He said, "Some guy tried, but it was awful, filled with crazy stories about aliens and strange flying objects. I hated it." So I assured him that I was a serious journalist and researcher, a generalist who wanted to tell the real story. Seconds into the first interview, he started telling me about aliens and strange flying objects, and I've thought ever since, "You got me, Bruce. You got me." Bruce used to talk about being 80 or 90, like Johnny Knapp, and still performing, at least until he dropped dead on stage. "I've got a gun to the back of my head," he'd say. "I can't retire. This isn't really a choice." He'd also say that he was probably supposed to be an accountant or insurance salesman, with a Volvo wagon, 2.5 kids, and a white picket fence. But there was the gun, and there was the stage, and one compelled Bruce to the other. Still, dying on stage was just an abstract notion from a master of the abstract, who took him seriously. He certainly didn't. And then there Bruce was, on May 1st, doing the most serious thing in his life. When he collapsed at the feet of guitar super kid Taz Niederauer, everyone in the Fox Theater thought it was another one of his slapstick bits, the kind of stage antic he was known for. So the band kept playing. Even after 3-4 minutes, they played. Keeping time and keeping track of time are not necessarily the same things. When you're playing on stage, it's hard to always tell how much time has gone past. You can't tell 15 minutes from 15 seconds, said Denny Wally, who was in shock for about a month after the show. Well, think about it. 4,600 people on their feet for almost 4 hours. All of these musicians who loved Bruce and felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him. It was all so overwhelming, like an overdose of love and joy affecting every fiber of Bruce. Then to go from that high moment to the absolute bottom, like almost into the pits of hell, it blows your mind in an instant. This was the most extraordinary event of my life. Even after it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, after Bruce had been taken away in the ambulance, Johnny Knapp, Jim Basile, musician, longtime Atlanta radio personality, and I figured we'd be laughing about this with Bruce at some future lunch. We figured Bruce would be fine. He seemed indestructible to those of us who have eaten with him. But we got the news around 1:30 a.m. as we approached the traffic light where 10th Street crosses Peachtree in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. Joe Zambi, one of Bruce's closest friends, and the godhead of the religion philosophy Bruce created, Zambi, called from the hospital. "He's gone," Joe said in a rickety voice that we could hear over Jim's Bluetooth. Then a long pause and an inarguable tone of finality. "Bruce is gone." Johnny sounded like he was in pain, crying, "Oh, no!" The atmosphere sucked from the car. We glided numbly down that stretch of Peachtree that used to be called the Strip, once upon a time Atlanta's little version of Haight-Ashbury. Somewhere to our right, just a few blocks down, was Piedmont Park, where 50 years earlier the Hampton Grease Band had played free concerts for the hippies who dug the band and never forgot its eccentric lead singer, a guy named Bruce. Chapter 1. Origin Myths and the Old Gray Goose. Her goslings are weeping, crying and peeping. Her goslings are weeping because their mammy's dead. These lyrics from an old folk song called Aunt Rhody, or the Old Gray Goose, were among Bruce Hampton's earliest memories, thanks to Liza May Williams, the former African-American slave who sang them when she cared for him in his infancy. She, or her memory, would influence Bruce for the rest of his life, long after she died. Liza May was his first real mother figure, and the simple music she planted in his baby brain took root in his soul. Bruce Coles Hampton was born on April 30th, 1947, in Knoxville, Tennessee, as Gustav Valentin Berglund III. Maybe. "He's not from this planet," observed his longtime friend Flournoy Holmes, the artist who created most of Hampton's album covers and the iconic Eat a Peach cover for the Allman Brothers Band. That would explain a lot about Bruce. While Bruce's idiosyncrasies came naturally and he was usually easygoing, he cultivated an otherworldliness that was a sure and often hilarious way to protect himself. He was fluent in trivia, strange noises, and gestures, and other sleight of hand that entertained a lunch table or a green room, or shifted the focus and changed the subject when he didn't want to discuss something, like his birth parents. But then it's easy to understand why Bruce would dodge that subject. His birth parents didn't spend much time in his life, and the little time they did spend with him wasn't the quality kind. His father, Gus Berglund, Jr., was from Hartford, Connecticut. His mother was Florence Cunningham Berglund of Atlanta, where she married Gus on July 14, 1945. Almost 2 years after marrying, the couple had a son in Knoxville. Bruce's birth made the news in Connecticut, where the Hartford Courant reported, "Bruce Coles Berglund has been born in Knoxville, Tennessee, to Mr. and Mrs. Gustav V. Berglund, Jr." According to his former significant other and longtime friend, Janet Wilson, Hampton found his birth parents an emotional topic. Bruce and Janet lived together for 10 years beginning in the late 1980s, first as a couple, then as roommates. They remained friends. "Talking about that stuff was always hard for him," Janet recalled. "So he kept it light, shifted the focus to something funny. That made him feel safe. He was protecting that part of him that felt damaged for being abandoned by his parents." Bruce's first wife, Ann Silver, added, "Laughter was medicine for him. That's how he dealt with being abandoned, by keeping things light and lively." Florence Cunningham was the second and youngest daughter of Colonel William A. Cunningham and Jane Coles Cunningham of Atlanta. Florence became very ill soon after Bruce was born, and Gus disappeared from the scene. "I'm pretty sure Bruce's family chased him from the scene and told him to go back north," Janet Wilson said. "My mother had multiple sclerosis," Bruce remembered. "But back then, they didn't really know much about MS. It took years before they found out what was really wrong. She was misdiagnosed with a mental illness and institutionalized." Florence died in 1968 at the age of 43, probably at Central State Hospital in Milledgeville. The facility is now closed, but it was her home for about half of her life, according to Bruce. In addition, the hospital was once the world's largest state mental asylum, with more than 200 buildings on more than 2,000 acres. The property's 25,000 unmarked graves also serve as a morbid reminder of the inefficiencies of antiquated mental health care. By the mid-1960s, Central State was overcrowded, with 12,000 patients and a doctor-to-patient ratio of 1 to 100. Florence's misdiagnosis was not uncommon for people with MS. Though Bruce didn't have much contact with his birth mother, close friends recalled a harrowing moment from his early childhood. "I think he might have been 4 or 5 when his mother stole the Merita bread truck," said actor Ron Clinton Smith, a 50-year friend. Florence somehow commandeered the bread truck and took Bruce on a desperate ride to the Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia, about 30 miles southeast of Midtown Atlanta. "She was seeking asylum," Janet Wilson said. "They didn't get asylum, but that experience left a lasting impression on Bruce," Smith added. "He was terrified, sitting there in the back of the truck while his mother drove him out of the city." Florence's sad life ended on February 16, 1968. Her sparse obituary in the Atlanta Constitution lists surviving family members including parents, siblings, and several nieces. The obituary also names the pastor officiating at her funeral, Dr. Vernon S. Broyles, who had married her to Gus Berglund 23 years earlier. There is no mention of Florence's only child. While Bruce's birth mother endured an institutionalized life, his father, Gus Jr., raised a family in Connecticut with his second wife, Phyllis. Together they had 2 children, Bruce's half-siblings, Mark and Mary Jane. The Gustav Berglund family of the greater Hartford area enjoyed what appears to have been a fairly traditional middle-class existence. A good, steady job for Gus, who worked for a painting company for many years, summer vacations, and holiday celebrations. At some point, I encouraged Bruce to try and find his father, recalled Ann Silver, who said the meeting took place sometime in the mid-'70s. Gus and Phyllis traveled to Atlanta to meet with Bruce, who also shared the story with Janet Wilson. Bruce sat in the parking lot for a while, real nervous about meeting his father, Wilson said, but he and Ann finally entered the hotel room. After a moment of awkward hellos, Gus offered Bruce a drink and a cigarette, Ann recalled, both of which he accepted, though he'd never indulged in either before. Hampton was not a drinker, but he did take up smoking cigarettes. He wouldn't give up the habit until decades later, when it had impacted his health. Not long after that first meeting, Bruce visited Gus up north, spending a few days with the Berglunds. It was pleasant enough, Ann remembered. Bruce was less nervous than the first time. They had a big, beautiful suburban home, and they seemed prosperous. Here was this other family that Gus cared for, children that he loved. But Bruce didn't get birthday cards or anything like that from his father, and never said much to me about what was churning in his heart during that visit. My own heart aches now to think of it. About 10 years after that meeting, on August 26, 1985, Gus died in his home at age 62. His obituary mentions his career, military service, and community involvement, and it lists survivors, including his wife, children, and brother. But it doesn't acknowledge Bruce's existence. Baby Bruce was just a few weeks old when his maternal grandparents, Colonel William A. Cunningham and Jane Coles Cunningham, took him in. The Cunninghams lived on Myrtle Street, a few blocks from Piedmont Park in Midtown Atlanta. The baby slept in the servants' quarters, where he was cared for by 80-something Liza May Williams, who had been born into slavery in the 1860s. Bruce lived in his grandparents' home until he was 3 or 4, and as he often said, those first few years are the most important. They certainly left an impression. For the rest of his life, he remembered Liza May's singing. I don't remember all the words, but I remember the inflection, the feeling, and she would sing for hours each night, and it's still amazing to me. I can still hear it, Hampton told filmmaker Michael Kopenick during an interview for the 2012 documentary Basically Frightened, The Musical Madness of Colonel Bruce Hampton. Speaking to journalist-author Scott Freeman in 2007 for a story in the Atlanta alternative newspaper Creative Loafing, Hampton said of Liza May's songs, "I can remember the flavor of them. They were like field hollers." Bruce further discussed Liza May Williams in a 2012 interview with author James Calamine. The conversation appears in Volume 1 of Calamine's book, Insured Beyond the Grave, published essays, interviews, and dispatches. Listening to her when I was 2, 3, 4 years old, and what she would play or sing, it was unbelievable, Bruce stated. I don't want to sound ridiculous about it, but I remember the feeling of the music, he told Calamine. She'd play Mahalia Jackson, Rosetta Tharpe, and all the greatest gospel music that's ever been played. I remember that music very vividly when I was growing up. In an April 2013 interview given a few weeks before his 66th birthday, Hampton described Liza May by forming a little O with his fingers and saying, "Her arms were about that big around. I remember that she ate cereal every morning, and she had constant energy into her 90s. She was from another planet." Bruce immortalized Liza May around countless lunch tables, in interviews with the media, and in Basically Frightened. But he did so most effectively in the song Sunshine Makes Eye Contact, on the 1978 album One Ruined Life of a Bronze Tourist. His lyrics allude to her life as a slave and servant, and the joyful chorus implores her to feel the sunshine. According to Bruce, Liza May eventually moved into and died at the Fulton County Almshouse, also called Haven Home, which provided institutional care for elderly and indigent people in Atlanta. Bruce's recollections of the woman who was closest to a mother figure during his toddlerhood were rooted in the oldest sounds he was aware of, an old African-American nursemaid singing to him. Liza May Williams's influence was lasting and profound. He was born into this kind of conflict of ambivalent caregivers and couldn't believe he was wanted, observed banjoist, singer, songwriter Jeff Mosier, one of Bruce's closest friends for more than 30 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?